Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our special show where we are going to discuss on a very important topic of secularism and privatization with one of the distinguished scholar and leading academician of the world, that is Mr. Professor Larry Baker. He is welcome, Professor.
Welcome.
Uh,
Thank you for having me.
Allow me to introduce Professor Larry Baker for our audience and particularly the worldwide who reviews and who sees our channels regularly. Professor Baker is a William Richard and Mary Elsman Faculty Scholar at Penn State University, Pennsylvania, United States of America. He is one of the leading scholar of law and international affairs. His works include particularly in shaping the political theory and particularly the phenomena of globalization, that how multinationals and corporations, particularly the big corporations, are shaping the political theory and political constitutional values across, and how the policymakers particularly are responding to the emerging scenario and the emerging problems which is being faced by the present day society across the globe. So, without wasting much of our time, we will. I will like to welcome Professor Larry Baker once again, and we think that we will have a very fruitful discussion over the subject matter of today's evening, that is secularism and privatization. So, Professor, welcome to the show. It's our privilege and pleasure to that you have consented and given us time out of your busy schedule. I know you are a very busy professor there, particularly in demand across the globe for your expertise and academic purposes. So, Professor, introduce yourself. Tell us about yourself, that you have been a non-American
Yeah, 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 yeah.
in your
Yeah.
origin,
This,
born and brought up in Cuba, and
yeah.
how this journey from Cuba to United States has shaped you as an individual.
Yeah, that this is actually the most difficult question of the hour. I tend to hate to talk about myself, and I'm very shy about it, but I will do it for you. So yeah, it's been a very interesting life journey, and it does make a difference. Our family started out in Cuba. We came over during the initial stages of the Cuban Revolution after 1959. Grew up in Miami, and always one of the most interesting things, and then went off to school in the Northeast and practiced for a number of years before I joined the academy. But there were a bunch of interesting things that may be worth mentioning just very briefly. One is that, of course, immigrants are always in a relatively special position, no matter how much you will fit in, and no matter how much you really do become part of your new home. And I am, and I'm extraordinarily grateful to a country that was able to welcome us as that you remain who you were and who you are. You are someone who comes in, and there's always this sense that no matter how embedded you are, you're always able to look at things from outside as well. And it's that kind of natural inside outsideness of the immigrant that maybe helped me develop the way I tend to approach everything, and both from the inside and then looking at things from the outside. It's been a very interesting journey. The first part of my life actually learning to become an American, and then, but at the same time, retaining my roots, and then traveling all over the world and seeing how that has shaped everything I see and do, which is more than enough about me, I think.
Professor, one of the highlights of your particularly life is about the challenges which you faced as part of immigration and the migrants particularly, and you have witnessed the culture across the globe, the culture influenced by religion, the culture influenced by constitutional democracy, forces of constitutional democracy, culture influenced by certain other factors like social poverty, socio-economic realities across the globe, culture forced by uh, so- some of the harsh realities of the life.
Yes.
So I will again rephrase my proposition like this,
Okay.
because the theme of the evening is secularism and privatization. Secularism as a constitutional principle, particularly, which has emerged perhaps in the 20th century and gained its more relevance, because we see the political theory and the history, particularly the church and the particular religion had a very dominant role in for the formation of a state, and the state as a separate political entity taking out the political power separately from the church was all about the evolution of a state, that yes, the religion should be separated and the church should not be the authority in the political affair. That if that is the dominant theme and the intersection of democracy or the state, and a state as a political entity, and religion as a social value or religion as a social construct. So how do you see the religion to enhance that democratic principle and representation across the globe in the constitutional democracy particularly?
All right. And this is actually a vital question, and really a question of first principles that's worth discussing deeply. The problem is that the question actually embeds more problems and questions than it provides solutions. And let me see if I can work through these just a little bit to give you a sense of the difficulty of even framing a question like this in a way that becomes socially or politically or legally useful. Right. One of the difficulties is that the notions, the language that we use to speak about secularism and religion is itself a very new one. And it is meant to answer a problem that did not exist, at least in political and social consciousness, until fairly recently. And that is the problem of how do you accommodate two things in the same space? One of them is full participation in the in the political, social, and economic life of the state, uh, where, and here's the other thing, where you're living in a state that is made up of multiple religions. In the ideal, the ancient ideal, where there was a unity, and one sees this, for example, in the old Tsarist notions in Russia, although it was never actually true, it was true enough to build political models. And that is where there was this absolute alignment between the people, their religion, their ethnicity, and their state. None of these issues become important. Secularism becomes a matter of indifference and in fact, to some extent, incomprehensible. But what happens when within a political state, multiple religions, multiple ethnicities have to share the same space? And this goes back, of course, to a problem that is very dear to me and near to me, which is the immigrant coming in to an otherwise established society. It's in that context and in the search for that solution, that is, how do you manage the dignity and the full participation, political, social, economic, and religious participation of an individual, and then of the collective of which he's a part, including a religious institutional collective, within a territory in which there's more than one, right? And so that becomes the issue. In that context, right, constructing the idea of religion to enhance democratic principles becomes problematic for a number of very important reasons. The first one is, who's got the power to construct this idea of religion? Is it the state? Is it Orthodox religious institutions? Is it the individual? So the question of the power to define the idea, that is, to impose meaning, what's a religion, what isn't a religion, to what extent do we view religion as useful, as a tool, to what extent is religion a social construct that is as critical, for example, as the family itself on which you build political ideals. So answering that question has proven to be extraordinarily difficult and the answers to it are sometimes very different depending on what country or what territory you happen to be in. All right, so who constructs this idea of religion? Is it the state? Is it religions, orthodox institutions, or is it the individual? In Russia, for example, and in many other states, it's the state that defines religion, that identifies it in the context of institutions of religion, and that everything else is either marginalized as threats to the state or are not recognized. In other jurisdictions, for example, the United States, the state does not engage in the business of defining religion. But then they have another problem, which is how do you recognize religion that you have no power to define, right? So and that produces very different results, right? Now, once you do that, once you get over the problem of defining or constructing the idea of religion, we have the problem of, in the way you phrase it, right, to enhance democratic principles and representation. The question then is, to what end are we doing all of this defining? Is it for the purpose of controlling these institutions and therefore the people within it? Is it for the purpose of ensuring that these religions don't act in ways that are inimical to the state, right, or to the stability or prosperity of the nation? Or is it to be a useful tool to develop something else, either institutional mechanisms for the control of a population or the enhancement of its prosperity and the stability of the nation, or for some other purpose, right? So, initial question, who constructs this thing? The second question, to what end? For whom is this to be developed? And that is not an easy question to answer, right? In some jurisdictions, Marxist-Leninist regimes, for example, and in some African states, the community, right, the collective becomes the more important object for which you construct these things. And when you look at democratic principles and representation, you're looking at the institutional furthering for which the individual has a responsibility. In other places like the United States, it's the opposite, right? You construct all of this to enhance the ability of the individual to navigate in a way that then enhances their autonomy, their fulfillment of their notions of happiness and welfare and the like. And so you've got that problem, right? And then the objective of enhancing democratic principles and of maintaining social stability and peace may not always align with the development of meaning for a religion. There are some religions, and in conversations among them, that have very, very different views about what enhancing democratic principles mean. And so if you're going to use them as part of the discussion, right, we're going to have an institution to institution discussion about it, we will have to either develop some kind of exogenous, that is outside of the conversation, baseline definition of what we mean by democratic principles and it's what we mean by enhancement, right? Any change can be either enhancement or a detriment, and you need a marker for this. Or we're going to have to figure out a way that to manage this so that in the course of these discussions, the objective, our understanding of the objective of democratic principles, social stability and peace, are going to align with the needs of the state, where you've got these multiple entities. And then the ultimate complication, right? I'm sorry to make your life difficult here, but the ultimate complication, of course, is where the state seeks to intervene in an effort to define religion and then to manage the levers of privilege among them, right? And so when you put all of this together, the answer to the question is, how do we construct the idea of religion to enhance democratic principles and representations becomes complicated. Contextually, it will differ contextually depending on the history, social development, customs and traditions of groups of people. It will depend on the history of the particular region. It will depend on the nature and character of the religious institutions. But having said that, the necessity of constructing an idea of religion that encompasses multiple religions, and that the alignment of that construction with a consensus around the baseline characteristics of democratic principles and a baseline consensus of what it means to enhance them rather than to move them back are absolutely necessary in order to move a state forward, however they approach the issue of secularism, religious involvement within a state, or religious, or building a wall of separation between them. And so when you get to a question like this, you're looking at three things, and they're three very difficult things: religion, enhancement, and democratic principles. And then the ultimate question is, who referees all of this? Where most of the participants are likely to want to shade the meaning of these in order to enhance their own position within a very tumultuous polity. So it's as good an answer as I'm going to be able to give you.
It is
Other,
all. It is going to be very difficult. Like you said, that it is very difficult to understand and define, particularly in a particular social political context. However, the very principle of secularism is based on equality. Equality in the space which you are talking about, and the particularly it rises the principle of secularism and the religion, right, fundamental right to religion, which the modern constitution also has. So if we go through the examples, there are three kinds of constitution talking about the principle of secularism and fundamental right to religion. One, where they do not have any express provision, still say that we will maintain the religious diversity and we follow the secular principles. Then there are constitutions which says that there is a fundamental right to practice, profess, and a particular religion, and the minorities will equally be protected. At the same time, we will follow the principle of secularism as one of the founding principle of our constitutionalism. And thirdly, there are constitutions which says that we have a state religion, still there will be we will follow the principle of secularism. So do you see the contrast, and particularly what are your observation on the constitutions which have secularism as one of the founding principle, at the same time have the state religion also? Like Pakistan constitution is a very interesting constitution. It has the it has the state religion, at the same time its preamble talks about secularism. So Indian constitution, in contrast, secularism was not added in the preamble, but it was subsequently added to emphasize that there has to be a protection of and respect for all the religion, and it cannot be one religion dominated social structure or the social political fabrication of Indian context in Indian context. At the same time, under article 25 and 26 of the Constitution of India, it has the fundamental right to religion also,
yeah.
while it has separate rights for protection of minorities based on lingual minorities and the religious minorities, as article 29 and 30 of the Constitution. So what essentially I mean to say, that whether religion and the secular principle, these secular principles which are there scattered here and there in the modern constitution, are in conflict with each other, because we see a rise of extremism. Those who talks about the democratic principle also talks about the extreme form of religious practices. They want to construct and the polarize or divide the society based on the line of religion in modern context or in contemporary context. How do you observe this rise of this phenomena, particularly which is going on in majority of the part?
Right. All right, these are very interesting. These are very interesting questions, and difficult ones. So we talk about a principle of secularism. The problem here, and my role has always been to find the problems of something that looks simple and then to complicate it. So let me complicate the issue of the principle of secularism. Then I'll get to Pakistan and India. Pakistan is a very interesting case. And then the issue of the tolerance of the intolerant in the context of religion, where the basis of the state is one that is built on this principle of secularism. All right, so with respect to the principle of secularism itself, we've seen, even within, for example, Western liberal democratic states, an enormous variation in what those words mean. They're like a fetish. Everyone says it, the principle of secularism, but you get 5 people in a room from 4 different parts of the world, and they mean very, very different things, right? So it becomes important at the outset to figure out what principle means and what secularism means. So, for example, in France, of course, the principle of secularism is bound up in a further principle of laïcité, that is, of privileging the non-religious over the religion and protecting the prerogatives of the state and of state activity, which is non-discriminatory, but of state activity, or that can be discriminatory if it's in some circumstances, but the principle of state superiority over other social, economic, and religious organizations that may threaten its supremacy. In the United States, principles of secularism, and in Germany it's slightly different, and Britain is different. In the United States, we embrace secularism, but not in the way of the French notion of laïcité. Their secularism involves accommodation, right? Sometimes mandatory, sometimes permissive, and an openness to religion within the political, social, and economic spaces, but one that is subject to limitations, which itself are the prerogatives of the state that must be undertaken without reference to the privileges of any one particular religion. Right? And so when you look at these principles of secularism, you can look at it in both ways. Right? And in other jurisdictions, the principle of secularism, as you suggest, and now with an eye to Pakistan mostly, but less to India, with the notion that the principle of secularism is really reduced to a principle of toleration of something, right? Sometimes of belief, sometimes of practices, sometimes of belief and practices, but only of a limited range of other religious groups, right? And sometimes named and sometimes not named, but with prerogatives, right? And privileges vested in one or another set of religious. It'll be secular in the sense that it is that minorities are not treated, are not burdened overmuch with respect to participation in political and social life, but at the same time, it's a toleration that is based on the assumed supremacy of a particular religion. Pakistan's case, and all of these, of course, then go back. And last point before I get to Pakistan and India, all of these go to the issue of, well, when you're looking at secularism, are you ultimately applying a principle of neutrality? That is, you're going to treat them all equally, and this is your principle of equality. Or are you going to impose a principle of anti-discrimination? That is, that you protect religions, especially minority religions, from the consequences of their minority provision, that is, the burdens that they may face because the adherents or the institutions of majority religions may seek to discriminate in favor of their own members, in favor of their own sensibilities and religious principles, and in that discrimination then impose it through the state on society. So in some jurisdictions, we're looking at neutrality. That would be at least officially Pakistan, and in some anti-discrimination. In the US, we're having a tremendous fight over which of these we mean when we talk about this. And again, in the context of what we mean by equality. Now, that gets us to India and Pakistan. Pakistan has been very interesting because, in effect, you are creating a Muslim society, and not just a Muslim society, but a Muslim society with particular privileges to a particular aspect of Islam, with relative tolerance of some others that tend to be somewhat of a challenge to the Orthodox Islamic community. The some of the Muslim sects, some of them are not even mentioned, and there's a question whether they're Muslim at all. Baha'is, for example. And certainly the Persian groups, the Zoroastrians that have come over, that have found a home in India, much more than in Iran and Pakistan. But that privileges this, and then builds a set of toleration principles and protections, right, against overburdening to everyone else. But as we've seen in Pakistan, that sometimes proves to be a challenge. A number of these are well known. Beyond the intra-Muslim fighting among those adherents of different sects, the law has been, there have been a lot of somewhat problematic instances of the law applied in very strategic ways against Christians, for example, and there have been some spectacular scandals or spectacular applications of the Pakistani constitution in ways that are troublesome for other polities that are using the same words, but that they mean very differently. So I'm trying to be very careful here,
Yes.
right? To the detriment of them, as well as some other problems that tend to be less well known in the West. The conversion, for example, of Hindu girls in the context of marriage arrangements, these kind of social coercions based on the notion, for example, here of a very limited toleration and in one direction mostly for conversion, right? Conversion, apostasy, and the like. And that really significantly changes or creates strong incentives towards Islamization of a particular kind, and then tends to burden, even though you've got this formal framework of a secular principle and toleration, the effect of the application of the rules tends to burden significantly the what had been a Hindu population, as I understand, has been shrinking dramatically for all kinds of reasons. A lot of people are very worried, as I understood it, about things like what they would call forced conversion, what the majority people would call, well, it's just the everyday way in which we do things in socially, and certainly the Christian community. India is, of course, a much more diverse country religiously, and so you don't have that. But the institutional politics of large religious institutions, especially between the various sects of Islam and the Hindu community, tend to play, as well, you know far better than I do, right? A much larger
that
role.
that
And then
that brings
again,
that brings to my next question to
yeah,
you, Professor, particularly in when we talk about now, because we are actually going to talk about the religion, nationalism, and political power. When the dominant political party of a state links the idea of religion with nationalism and raise it to the level of matter of pride, and then that helps to capture the political power. We have seen it in the Afghanistan. There the religious, particularly religious group, extremist religious group, have recaptured the political power. Here in India, we see a lot of talkings about the religious aspect, particularly surrounding to religion, when it comes to the general election or the elections, dividing the politicians or if the leading from the leading political parties talking about the on the line of like extreme religious preachers dividing the community. So how do you see this in a constitutional democracy surviving all of this? This is a very interest. This actually becomes a very interesting, particularly interesting from the perspective of India as a subcontinent, largest democracy.
Yeah. No, that is actually the question of the moment. And we have variations of that all over the world. I mean, India is a laboratory, but it's not the only place where this is undergoing. The Americans are having a conversation similar, not as intense by any means yet. A
Yeah.
similar conversation is the conversation we're having in Europe and to some extent in Africa and Latin America. But there are two aspects of this. One of them is the liberal democracy, just in some variation, has tolerated that and even permitted it without much fuss, permitted its constitutionalization when it has been used, for example, to further anti-discrimination policy. The very famous provision, I think it's Article 170 of the Malaysian Constitution, or my numbers are terrible, but one that defines a Malay as a person who was born in a particular territory, who is Muslim, and who embraces the ethno characteristics that defines you as a Malay. So there you combine religion and ethnicity, and you define it in the Constitution, and then you do this for the purpose of providing anti-discrimination of, I guess, original peoples or a dominant group, which is now subject to outsiders who are also now Malaysians, but who have greater privileges. So you've got that aspect. And in the context of dealing with this, people have not had problems with this, but yet it's a door. So you walk through this door, and then you get to India. And you go, well, okay, if we do this, and we have all kinds of, we go back 1,000 years of Indian history, we've got all kinds of contests and historical relationships between at least two, there's a third, right, between two hugely important political religious institutions. The one is Hindu, the other is Muslim. The third, of course, which has disappeared to some extent, except maybe in the South, the Buddhist institutions, right, all of which had been quite prominently political. Now all of them grudgingly agreeing to live with each other in some ways, but in a context in which the rules for living with each other remain somewhat fluid, right? And for India, the problem is, as you mentioned, and quite nice and quite well, is the problem of how you both recognize the institutional power of these religions. You protect minority religions, or you provide a space for them to engage equally, right, without having a hijacking of the institutions of state, even as you allow these institutions to speak politically as religious institutions, right, preserving that space and then drawing that line where you can't cross your principle of secularism, right? That's the line that can't be crossed, and then that line has to be flexibly understood and operated. But in the absence of a commitment by the leaders of all of these religious institutions, and including the minority ones and their protection, no piece of paper, no writing, no secular institution will ultimately be able to overcome a sustained action. But if in fact that's where you go, you get to the question which is underlying your question, and one that goes to the part of the earlier question that I wanted to get to, and that is the notion of intolerant religions, these terrorists and revolutionaries. You get at some point to the question, are we living in a liberal democratic state? Are we living in a secular liberal democratic state? Are we willing to make the compromises necessary to keep that? And if we're not, right, what kind of state do we have? And that's a conversation no one wants to have. Everyone wants to get as close to that, privileging their own institutions as possible. But that becomes the key issue. And the easy answer to your question is, when you cross the line, and it doesn't matter which religious institution it is, when you cross the line and you capture the organs of state, then all you have left are the words secularist principles, liberal democracy, but do you really have that in fact? India hasn't gone anywhere near crossing that line, but people worry. The Americans haven't crossed that line yet, but people are constantly worrying. But having said that, it is as dangerous, I suspect, to be hysterical about the threat of that in a vibrant democracy as it is not to worry about it sufficiently, right? Either way can produce the kind of panic among the masses that is very dangerous. And indeed, I think people like us who are in positions of influence and authority have an added responsibility to ensure that we do not tolerate or create incentives towards hysteria among those people for whom, to some extent or another, through our influence, our dialogue, our participation in discussion, we have a responsibility for their welfare. And in the context of preserving the core principles of our democracy, of our liberal democracies, as they're set out. So the answer is, yeah, these things can go down the drain very easily. And yeah, these institutions, whether they are American religious institutions, can become very problematic and can destroy the system. But it doesn't have to be that way.
So, uh, particularly the constitutional democracy has the three limbs, particularly one, the political, the other, social, and the third, economic aspects. I will be taking you to the next limb when it comes to the role the religion plays in a constitutional democracy, or the particularly the secular principles.
Ah,
Uh, and I'm going to pose you the another the question which actually concerns with the in typical Indian society, or even you can say that the society which is uh, layered society or divided into the various segments and the groups based on birth or the race or the caste in the case of Indian society. Like the dominant Hinduism is based seeks to divide the Indian society into different layer of castes, which actually discriminates against each other. The dominant caste, particularly the upper caste, say that that the yes, you belong to the lower strata of the society or the downtrodden of the society, and you need to worship us, you need to follow us, and which are so inherently discriminatory. They perpetuated the discriminatory practices and in the name of religion and the religious with the help of religious authorities, like in the ways like temples and all those, as a part of social culture, social cultural aspects, or the way of living, so-called way of living. So here my question is that how do you see the role of religion in a layered society which is fundamentally unequal or full of inequality?
ah,
Whether religion plays an important role as a tool of whatsoever, like whether it contributes towards the any of the constitutional goal, which in a particularly in a society where it is so structurally discriminatory and particularly unequal in every aspects, be it social, political, or even the social discrimination is so widely prevalent in Indian context.
right. That is, you're asking just incredibly difficult questions, which I really appreciate because they're getting me to think hard. And ones for which there is, of course, the more difficult the question, the harder it is to get an easy answer. So there's no easy answer here. So let me take your question apart because it's a brilliant question, but it has a bunch of parts. All right. So part one, you've got discriminate, and here in a sense we've moved beyond neutrality as part of the principle of secularism, and here we're really focusing on the principle of anti-discrimination. Right.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
case number one, Muslim versus Hindu, that is inter-religious discrimination. irrespective of what your religion says, that's the easiest case for the secular state to mediate. Muslim cannot discriminate in the societal and political realms against a Hindu solely on the basis of his religion, and vice versa, right? Or against Buddhists, or against Christians, or against Jewish people, or against Shinto, whatever, right? That's easy. Much harder. What happens when the discrimination is inherent in the theology, cosmology, and ethics within a religion, and that it involves the practice of the religion necessarily involves a set of social parameters that are discriminatory in the sense that it assigns people to different roles and aspects and manages their what appears to outsiders certainly to be their social relations, but within the theology of the religion is actually a foundational aspect of the religion. That becomes much harder. And there are two ways of dealing with, well, there's multiple ways of dealing with them, but two at the extreme. One is to say that within the religion, in the religion's operations of itself, those are things that have to be tolerated. We do that in the US, for example, with respect to the application of some of the discrimination laws by religions when they operate religious schools or when they operate their own organizations as religions. Right. But with respect to other aspects of their operation, so in the US, if you're religion and you have to discriminate in favor of your own people, but you're also operating a candy store that sells candy to everyone, that discrimination becomes much, much, much more problematic. Right. So that's one way of looking at it, a small space for toleration of that within the internal operation of a religion. More problematic in the West, but perhaps to some extent an object of deep conversation in India, is the extent to which that toleration can seep outward into the social relations among those religious people, right, within the state generally. And then the big the thing that will really set you off is the extent to which it ought to it's actually for me the easiest question, but maybe a hard question in India, the extent to which there ought to be a wall between these religious sensibilities and relationships and the ability of every Indian to participate autonomously within the political sphere, right?
Yeah.
In the construction and
So,
operation of the state.
but it's actually the very difficult when it comes to the within a particular religion. This when it is the practices, and particularly when it seeks to discriminate, and particularly inherently discriminatory in their practices and all those. However, when we talk about the solution, one of the solution which the chief architect of Indian Constitution, that is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, proposed, and particularly which runs throughout the very fundamental scheme of fundamental right, is that right to dignity through means of education. Do you believe that the education and the right education will enhance the meaning of these rights and these democratic principles like secularism? Do you believe,
Oh.
do you, do you believe, what's your take on whether the state should be the part of the education system which promotes the religious text or the religious education? I strongly believe that here or even the globally, there are demands of the right, like that there should be religious text or the education based on religious activities also, and the religious text also. And there is a lot of consensus debate which is going on, and particularly in India it is going on, where the people have started identifying even the language with religions. So that becomes further problematic, because you have to protect those languages, those religions also, and at the same time you have a duty to provide the sign and inculcate scientific temperament for the progress, peace, and development of the society. So, how do you construct the very role of the state as a political entity or the repository of political power in such a context?
Well, the reason I was laughing as you were asking the question was that you have hit the electrocution button of the arguments, the very arguments that have been going on for a generation in the United States. That that's it. Religious organizations in the United States, like every other group, every other identity group, has discovered, as you correctly note, the power of education. The question then in the US is who controls the content of that education, which is the problem in India as well, and to what ends. You, I think correctly, and I share your view, that the object of state education ought to be to educate the population in the principles on which the state is founded, right? All of its principles as it relates to the state. And it is for religious institutions to inculcate with their adherents and their children whatever it is that they want to inculcate within, and always very sensitive to their responsibility to be good citizens within the constitutional order. That works fine. But as we've seen in the United States, even in a quote unquote more advanced secular state, the issue becomes so sensitive, right? And certainly over the last 40 or 50 years in this country has become so sensitive that everyone understands that if you can control education, you can shift it more religiously oriented, or you give people the right to opt in or out of particular aspects of education through your exercise of your free exercise rights and the like, you can substantially change the way the population understands their political system. Right. My sense is, and I share this belief, I think, with you, that the role of the state, especially where you've got multiple significantly powerful religious institutions, is to ensure that there is a space for the teaching of those rules, principles, institutions, and organs that binds everyone together. And then what individuals do with that, both outside of their religion and within their religion, is up to them. That's the nature of democracy. And where it takes you, it's not for me to say, right? But when the state then becomes an instrument of a particular religion or a group of religions, then the question, then we go back to your original and your powerful question is, what have we now done to the principle of secularism? If you cannot teach, if there is no space where religions can meet and discuss, that's the essence of democratic engagement in a multi-religious state, then what do you have? Right? It becomes then you have something closer to what you have, depending on where you are in India, 800 or 900 miles from wherever you are going towards the west.
West,
Yeah.
Afghanistan.
towards the Pakistani model, for example,
Yes.
where that space is already taken over by a dominant discourse. Or the example of Afghanistan, right, where you've got a tolerant constitution, but the judges all have to be experts in the Hanafi school of Islamic jurisprudence in order to engage in constitutional interpretation. Well, at that point, you've lost it. It may be nominally secular, but it isn't, and it certainly isn't the Indian model.
So education based on rationality and particularly the scientific temperament, which advances the peace, coexistence, harmony in the society, in a given society, and seeks to preserve the diversity, particularly the very identity and the core of a particular society, is the answer to the extremist principles, which are the extremist form of religion which is growing up across the globe. because
including in the United States. I mean,
including in the
no
United States.
space.
It's not confined to the South Asian region or the a particular part of the globe. It is growing across the extremism is growing across the globe. Be it even in the Europe also, the way some of the incidents which has happened when in last few years uh, compels us to think that the where is the tolerance, and the principle of coexistence particularly. So Professor, I will be taking you to the third limb of the democracy, constitutional democracy, that is and my questions will be focusing now, shifting from the political to the social to the economic.
Okay.
Do you believe that the religion and the has some sort of role to play in the economic constitutionalism, or the even the analyzing the even the economic justice, particularly the kind that we talk about justice, the social, political, and economic. So how do you see the role of religion in enhancing the economic rights or the economic justice, see,
Okay.
furthering the economic justice?
All right. And you're going to hate me again. There's no easy answer. There's no easy answer. Let me start with history.
Yeah.
Religions have for a long time, especially the major religions in the US and India, have for a long time thought themselves quite concerned about the nature of what we now call macroeconomic policy, corporate ethics and responsibility, and the like, the Islamic concept of riba, the Christian concept of usury, right? All of these were grounded in religion. They've transposed themselves to some extent into secular language, but it would be, I think, it would be a mistake to believe that there can be a clean break between economic policy, economic systems, just viewing it from the perspective of scientific rationalism, without at the same time acknowledging that religion, certainly from their perspective, believe they're very much engaged in the morality of economic conduct, and that they have been from their inception. So a space has to be created in there for some kind of dialogue. The problem is when you move from normative, trans religiously practice norms, from when you move from that to systems or to norms, habits, or policies that then inevitably favor one group over another, then you've got a problem. And at that point, the state really has to mediate, right? So in a sense, the question boils down to some extent, religions ought to be involved in the construction of macroeconomic policy and in the fundamental norms and principles within which its fairness is understood and practiced within a society. At the same time, it is important to realize that religious institutions, like non-governmental institutions like Apple and Facebook and IBM and the Tatas, all of them are also economic actors, and to that extent ought to be subject to, on an equal basis, to the overarching economic policies of the state, which ought to enhance individual prosperity, right, rather than the prosperity or the specifically religious objectives of any one of these market players. So the answer then becomes a little complicated. Yes, and in that context, of course, India or the United States or China does not stand alone. Those discussions are not just internal, but they are necessarily external to find common ground with the Americans, the Africans, the Chinese, even the Russians, right? And in that context, right, I agree with you, though, the implication of your comment that in that context, the principle of secularism, neutrality, and non-discrimination ought to be really firmly in place. But at the same time, there is a space, especially in the context of the normative content of economic policy, for some interventions by religious organizations as participants in the creation of macroeconomic policy, but not as market actors.
So because particularly it becomes very important, particularly in the context of globalization. Uh, some of the MNC, as you named, Facebook, Tesla, or even Tata's, they they have the influence. They have uh, uh, they do the businesses across the globe. For that matter, Amazon, the Jeff Bezos companies has presence in almost all more than 140 economies. So the those countries, those economies have certain set of written principles in the form of constitution, which also seeks to deal with the social and political aspects. So they have the companies like this, Amazon, or even the Facebook, or even the Twitter, or even the Tatas, which are even the which provides how which are common do businesses globally. They have an capacity to influence and impact the very rights discourse of a particular country based on the religious or the principle of neutrality or the principles of discrimination, impacting the principle of neutrality and impacting the principle of anti-discrimination also. Like, suppose that a Amazon uh, starts delivering a food product without disclosing the very content, and the which hits or which seeks upon the or is silent about the
Right.
con- uh, the content of the food product, uh, on the religious aspect. Like, some of the religion says that this food product is prohibited, this food is not
Yeah.
eatable, or this is completely unacceptable to this particular religion. So and it just takes the advantage or the advantage of the silences of the laws or the gaps in the laws of a particular economy, and then the individual gets to know. So my question is that, can we have a standardized principles of accountability for these multinational corporations,
Okay.
to to make them accountable, or to make them to so that they enhance the basic dignity and basic rights of the individual?
Okay. The answer is maybe. This is one of the ones where I'm not going to start by providing all kinds of problems. The answer is maybe. Clearly, it is possible, and I certainly have been working very hard over the last 15 or 20 years to contribute somehow to making this possible. There are ways of developing national, global, if you like, mechanisms for accountability. And you mentioned one of its key pillars, which is transparency, right?
Transparent.
The mechanisms are possible to create transnationally. The difficulty, and there's always a difficulty, and this is where, in fact, we are having a huge problem now in the context of the negotiation of an international treaty for business and human rights. The problem isn't the mechanism. That's easy enough to do. The problem is the normative standards that they're going to apply for accountability. Accountability with respect to what? And there we've discovered over the last 15 or 20 years that getting consensus, except at a really high level of generality, which is fairly useless, is extraordinarily difficult. So, yeah, you can do it. And yeah, we can develop mechanisms, but there's always its mechanisms. And yes, you can develop a very generalized normative universe of principles that you're going to apply, but there's always going to be contextual and sometimes significant contextual differences in how you add meaning to what it is you're going to be accounting and how it is you're going to be measuring conduct for the purpose of determining whether accountability has produced a sense of violation, a sense of breach, or a sense of damage for which there ought to be a remedy. So that's actually the real issue. Yes, accountability. Yes, there ought to be responsibility. The problem is the norms. And indeed, from the perspective of India and other states that tend to be now in the upper or in the middle tiers of global production, that is an important thing. especially where Indian contextual sensibilities may be very different, for example, from that in France or that in China. And so if there's a uniformity and there's a bending towards the French or the Chinese version of things, the Indians are not going to feel particularly well served by global systems of accountability. So you have to be careful. But the answer is yes, and we ought to be, and we are moving towards that in a context in which religion will have to play a secondary but not a primary role.
So, particularly because I have just browsed your literature work and particularly the kind of work which you have done in the past and particularly currently doing. Yeah, my last question before we wind up this program, this conversation. How do you see the very rise of private players, the non-state actors particularly, and their interface with the rights of the individual? Can we, because the rights in Indian context, it is very simply it is the dominant theme, or even the Supreme Court says that we cannot issue writs against the private companies or the private corporations for the enforcement of fundamental rights.
Yeah, I think that's foolish. And I have actually spoke about this just
Yeah.
a couple of weeks ago. I've been writing since certainly over the last 10 years with the notion that, and it's a foolishness that is the state's own fault. Over the course of the last 30 years, the states have chosen to governmentalize, to shift down for reasons of laziness, for reasons of risk aversion, for reasons of just the trajectories of the way in which societal organizations are changing. There are all kinds of reasons. They've effectively governmentalized large, especially large, both domestic and transnational organizations, not just companies, profit-making companies, but non-governmental organs and religious institutions as well. And my sense is that if in fact what you've done is governmentalize them, then to that extent they ought to be treated like, have the responsibilities of, including the responsibilities for protecting the basic core political values of the state that the state has. And so if in fact you've now shifted this down so that Apple becomes a kind of privatized administrative organ of a state, then they ought to be subject in that context to the same responsibilities as a state. But in the process, of course, you've done two things. You have now privatized the government, because in a lot of cases also you have the state now acting as a private entity, right? And you've got private companies, including non-governmentals, acting as a governmental entity. That will require a conversation in the next 10 or 15 years to decide, well, this distinction between the burdens and responsibilities of the state and the burdens and privileges of non-state actors, that has to fall away, and a new and more equitable system of responsibilities for those who bear these governmentalized functions ought to be developing. And I'm certainly helping to try to help to contribute to this. But I think you're absolutely right. Those distinctions, they were very nice in the 20th century. They do not work. They do not accord with reality today.
Because even I see the essential governmental functions which were performed by the state earlier in for the furtherance of fundamental rights, like the promises of the constitution, now being performed by the private players and the big private corporations and the non-state actors. So why the burden and the same set of responsibilities should not be casted upon them, and why the judicial institution should say? I don't see the logic, even as you say that particularly from the Indian context.
Right.
Because
you're a child of the 21st century. A
yes,
lot of people are still clinging to the old distinctions, which made sense in the 1960s, but they certainly don't make sense in 2021, given the realities of the operation of economic production, of politics, and everything else in the world.
It becomes, and I can tell you with my little bit of experience that it becomes another set of tool of discrimination, particularly in Indian context, because the so-called as I discussed, the Indian societal system is inherently discriminatory, layered society, or the structured into the various caste and subcaste and the groups within a religion, within a so-called religion, Hinduism. So the these private corporations has become another tool of discrimination and perpetuating that discrimination. They provide, they say that we are not bound by the providing equal opportunity for the employment. We are not bound by we are not bound to give you the equality in terms of pay and perks and even work conditions or even the leaves. And there are instances which we as a lawyer come across. The when it comes to the private schools and the facilitating the right to education in Indian context, there are discriminatory practices which are being practiced by the private schools, dividing the class into the social origins.
Mm.
And that reminds me of the Brown versus Brown celebrated case of Brown,
This is
1954
great.
United States Supreme Court, where the class was segregated based on the class race, particularly, and the color of the students. So here the such discriminatory practices are being followed, that who are from the privileged class or who are from the less privileged class, and how it is coming. So even my quest is that this notion has to go, because the private players and the companies are performing the governmental functions, and the responsibility, the same set of responsibility and same set of accountability has to be fastened upon them in the present day scenario and the new emerging economic order,
Right.
which has.
Yeah, and that really has to be the basis of the conversation about the extent that that occurs, its form, its mechanisms, and its limits. That really is a conversation that most societies are not having yet, but that they need to, and not just India, the United States as well.
So, Professor, it was lovely talking to you, dealing on all the aspects of the political democracy, political constitutional democracy, particularly the social, political, and the economic aspects, and its interlinkages with the two dominant themes, that is the religion and secularism under the constitution scheme of constitution. It was lovely talking to you because of your expertise and experience from the worldwide, the examples which you have given, and the theorizing part particularly, which you have, it can be done. A professor of your stature can only do it, because you have devoted your life and particularly the experience which you have. Uh, so it was lovely talking to you, and I hope my viewers and listeners will be benefiting from your expertise and listening this conversation, and will have a very right perspective about the religion, the impact which it has in a given society, and how do we coexist by preserving the diversity and peace and harmony in a given constitutional society. Thank you very much.
And thank you. It was a great pleasure to sit with you and have this extraordinary conversation. I am really grateful for the opportunity to chat with you. So thank you as well.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Bye bye.